Hello and welcome to your Daily Detroit. It is Thursday, October 27th, 2022. I'm Jer Stays. So I've gotten a lot of questions over the last few weeks about the three proposals on Michigan's ballot. It seems very clear to me that listeners know who they're going to vote for when it comes to the election this year in November, but they're not quite sure what, and they're looking for more information. There's three ballot proposals that are statewide. To help sort it out, talking to Eric Lupher. He is president of the nonpartisan Citizens Research Council of Michigan, to give us a look under the hood of what these proposals really mean from a policy perspective. If you only want to listen to one or two of the conversations, in the show notes, I've put timestamps for you to skip through in case you've already made your decision, but you're looking for one or another. All right, let's get started. Joining me virtually, Eric Lupher. He is the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. It's one of the organizations that I lean on, and their work that I lean on, when I want to get a real good perspective of what's actually happening with policy and various things. Eric, first off, welcome to Daily Detroit. And can you give people an idea, especially because we're going to be talking about three ballot proposals here, what the CRC of Michigan, and really where are you all coming from so people know the voice that you're talking with?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today. The Citizens Research Council is a 106-year-old organization that was created with the idea that better information leads to better decision-making, better policy-making. So we don't come about looking at public policy issues from a conservative or a progressive perspective, but the idea that good government is going to come about when those making the decisions on policy have good information in front of them. Now they're going to apply their own policy lens to it if they're conservative or progressive or what have you. But if we can all start with the basic understanding of the facts, then we're going to form better policy. And at times like this, a few weeks ahead of the general election, we, the people, are the policymakers. We have three constitutional amendments proposed that we vote on. They won't take effect unless we, the people, adopt them. So we are the policymakers, and the Citizens Research Council provides some analysis of that. So before you vote absentee or head into the polling places, you can do your homework and see what they're about and think about how these proposals may or may not affect your life.
My experience is that a lot of people have made their minds up about whatever elected official that they're going to be, especially near the top of the ballot. But I've gotten a lot of questions about these proposals to help people sort them out, because it's not as clear to them because they're looking at it through their lens of candidates or whatever. But ballot proposals have a huge ability to set the course forward for our state and make impacts for many election cycles to come, right?
When we craft a constitution or amend it, as we are doing, as was proposed now, we're creating the fundamental structure upon which all other policy will be made. So it really is the foundational pieces for everything that follows. And I should add, we're not, in describing these, we're not endorsing them, we're not opposing them, we're trying to provide information. We don't lobby, we don't support candidates for office. We're just in the information business.
And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about you. So let's get started. Statewide ballot proposal 22-1, I believe the 22 stands for 2022, term limit reform and financial disclosure. Now, I thought we already had some form of term limit, so why don't you unpack what's going on and the changes that this proposes?
In fact, Michigan has had term limits for 30 years. They apply to both the legislative and the executive branch. Proposal 1 would amend the term limits that apply to our legislative branch. Current constitutional provisions say that people may serve 3 terms in the House, 6 years in total, 2 terms in the Senate, 8 years in total, or 14 years combined if you're able to piece those together. And what we have seen during that time is a number of officials have jumped between the two or attempted to jump between the two. They haven't always been successful in winning the votes of the people. But because their time in each chamber is so short relative to a greater understanding of policy issues and getting to know the other legislators serving with them, ultimately policy making is about compromise and understanding different people's perspective on issues. The proponents say that we have been shortchanged through this process. And they propose to allow legislators to serve 12 years. It's less than the 14, but 12 years is still substantial. And they can do that any way they choose. So they can serve all 12 years in the House, all 12 years in the Senate, or jump between them if that's what how they think it's going to work best for them. Now, again, the people have to elect them, so you still have to be accountable and serve your constituents. Not everyone. We found that only 6% of the legislators over those past 30 years have been able to put together 14 years. Another 5% have been able to serve 12 years in total. So that leaves roughly 90% of people in the past haven't been able to fully use term limits, and we think 12 years is probably substantial enough. But there are some issues with it, and the proponents think that by allowing people to be longer in either chamber, it'll serve some of the weaknesses that we found with our shortest in the nation chamber limits.
I've heard the criticism over the years that because Michigan has among the strictest term limits, that there's kind of like a form of revolving door. That's one criticism that I've heard between, say, those who lobby and those who are in the legislature. I will state here that this specifically does not eliminate term limits. I think some people thought that this actually changes term limits, correct?
Yeah, it changes them. It does away with our old system and creates a new system, but we're going to have term limits with or without this amendment.
Right. And it does take a long time to kind of understand policy and, build relationships and things like that. There's a second part to this as well, financial disclosure. Can you unpack that for us too?
Michigan is one of only 2 states in the nation that doesn't have a law requiring financial disclosure for its statewide elected officials. So in this case, the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, or members of the House or the Senate. And this proposal would mandate that the legislature get to the business of enacting a law requiring financial disclosure. And the requirements for a minimum of what that law must contain is a list of the assets, the sources of income, the liabilities, any positions held. So if you serve on a corporate board or a nonprofit board, anything like that, arrangements made for future employment. So what you just referred to, the sort of revolving door, you're a legislator one day and a lobbyist the next, we should know about that. Any gifts received, payments made, reimbursements for travel, or sometimes these things can be done to a charity in lieu of that. So still there's a benefit there. So the fundamental part of this is it creates a law that 48 other states have and that is required of our members of Congress, that they create some transparency in their lives so that we can know, are they making decisions for the state's best interest, for their district's best interest, or for their own best interest. The only way we can have any of that information is to be able to peek a little bit into their private lives and see some of this. And the trick really is to thread the needle. If it's too much disclosure, you have the threat of turning people away. They just don't want people peeking into their private lives. But some transparency is good, and so it'll be up to the legislature to find that right balance.
Is it fair to say that Michigan is an outlier? You mentioned 48 states. That really does put Michigan as an outlier, doesn't it? I mean, is that a fair characterization?
Oh, yes, it's definitely an outlier. Michigan and Idaho are the only 2 states lacking a law of this nature.
Do you have any idea from a policy perspective why this wasn't enacted, or is that something that we can't really see into the history that well?
As I say, you're trying to thread the needle, and ultimately you're asking legislators to enact a law to create more transparency in their own lives. So they have house rules that they have to provide this, but it's sort of internal. It's been self-serving, it's why do that when you're compromising your own privacy and you're compromising information that affects your wife and kids or husband and kids. But at the same time, 48 other states have been able to figure this out, and there's really no excuse why we haven't.
All right, let's move on to Proposal 22-2, Promote the Vote 2022. This is going to make some changes to some voting and elections provisions. I really am interested to hear your explanation of this because this is one I really do not understand as well myself.
It does make some changes, but a lot of it is taking existing statutory code and embedding it into the Constitution, and in doing so will make it harder to change in the future. Now, one side of that is good because we're living in the post-2020 world with all this allegations of improprieties and things like that. So proponents of this say, well, we need to have security and know that people have the right to vote and have secure ways of doing that. The bad side of that is life changes, right? How we operate today is different than what we were doing 20 or 50 years ago. And so are we locking things into our Constitution that are going to impede us from having a state-of-the-art system a few years from now? So what does this do? First of all, it says that voting is a fundamental right that cannot be impeded and you can't be harassed as you're voting. That is currently state and federal law. There's nothing new there. It deals with absentee voting. We have, since 2018, had no reason absentee voting. That was the earlier version of Promote the Vote, saying everyone should be able to do this. So this clarifies some of the things, the ability to get your absentee ballot just by requesting it and putting your signature on that. That's current law. It allows clerks to create a list for everyone who just wants to vote absentee into the future. This has been current practice for many city and township clerks. The requirement will be new. It allows overseas voters to know their vote will be counted if it is postmarked by election day and received within 6 days. That is new. Before, it had to be received by election day. It creates a requirement that the state provide funding for at least one drop box in every community. Now, many communities already have drop boxes, so that's not new, but the funding is, and for those communities that don't have a drop box, that'll be new.
Quick question. What is their definition of community? Is it like one drop box per city? Because that could be very different in a city, say Dearborn or Detroit or Madison Heights or, Okemo. You know what I mean? Or is it by
Right.
county? What does that mean?
No, it is every city and township. Those are our voting units. And if you have a bigger city, over 15,000 people, then the funding increases to provide multiple drop boxes.
Okay.
So I think our report says Detroit, under this formula, would qualify for funding for 27 drop boxes. But they have to be in secure places, and there's a lot of law that goes around that.
Yeah, that would actually, from my experience, provide multiple drop boxes per council district, just for a little bit of local information there, just doing some simple math.
That's right. So also related to the absentee voting, it would create a system. The analogy is like Amazon. So under the system, when you apply for an absentee ballot, you would then go in and you would be able to go online and say, the absentee ballot has been sent to me. I've turned it back in. It's sitting on the clerk's desk. Now they've opened it. And wait a second, they saw my signature was missing. So just like Amazon, you order and you can see your order is in a warehouse in Utah, and now it's been shipped to Toledo, and now it's at the Detroit post office. You would be able to track that electronically and have greater confidence that your ballot has been received and is being counted.
So to be clear, that's status tracking. That is not voting online. That is status tracking of the ballot.
That's status tracking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Your vote won't be counted until election day, but you would at least know that it's been received. It's not in a post office somewhere and has been lost or anything like that. So the next thing, it deals with early in-person voting. This is a new thing. Many other states already have this type of thing. And in Michigan, you've been able to go in early and ask for your absentee ballot and vote on the spot and turn it back in. Under early in-person voting, you would actually be able to feed it into the machine and know that it's being counted. The requirement is for a minimum of 9 days of early in-person voting. Every city and township would have to do this. They could do it in collaboration with another community, not so much an issue in Detroit, but as you get upstate where there's smaller communities, townships could work together or cities could work together, things like that. The votes would be fed into the machine, but they wouldn't begin to be counted until election day. There would be no early reporting of results. And then we had the issues after 2020 of after the election and the Promote the Vote 2022 says that we're going to create a new system for breaking ties for any statewide elections. It adopts what local governments have been doing. It takes the audit requirements and says that they must be done in public, done by state and county officials based on established guidelines. For anybody that's watched the news after 2020, Arizona, they had this third party come in and they wanted to do this whole audit of who had confidence in them. Though nobody chose them to do it other than some of the people in the Arizona legislature. So this would clarify only in public and only by election officials. And then after the fact that canvassing, the people on the board of canvassers can only look at the numbers on the page and say column A is greater than column B and that candidate wins. They can't go into all sorts of different issues. It would be spelled out in the Constitution. So what are the things to think about? I started off talking about the issues with putting things like this into the Constitution. It is taking a lot of statutory, very fine minutia and putting it into the Constitution. There's pros and cons to that. It creates some additional cost by requiring the early in-person voting, by requiring that tracking system, by funding the drop boxes, but it does create a secure, established system that anybody can understand and opportunities for greater participation in the voting process.
I thank you for going through all that because the constitutional amendment proposals this year, there's a lot of steps to these. They do a lot of things at once. And I think that that can be sometimes just a lot for voters to process, you know?
It can be overwhelming, sure.
Let's move to Proposal 22-3, Reproductive Freedom for All. This is the one that you see all of the commercials about. This is the political hot potato, to put it mildly. So let's talk about what this does, because there has just been so much confusion and shifting things around this topic in Michigan. What would this proposal do?
This proposal comes in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court decision deciding that Roe v. Wade was decided wrongly 50 years ago. And in doing so, they created a vacuum in federal law, and that means that every state is free to make a law as it sees fit. Michigan had a law in the books that could not be enforced because of the Roe decision that dates back to 1846, and it allows for abortions only to protect the health of the mother. So one of the strictest provisions of any state in the nation. The proponents of Proposal 3, the Reproductive Freedom for All, want to go back to a life similar to what we've known for the last 50 years under Roe v. Wade. This proposal would make the right to make and effectuate decisions about all matters related to pregnancy that of the mother, the woman who becomes pregnant, and her healthcare professional, the doctor, the nurses that are treating her. It deals with pregnancy, so it's bigger than abortion. It deals with, at a minimum, prenatal care, child care, postpartum care, contraception, sterilization, miscarriage management, infertility, and of course abortion is part of this. Under the Roe v. Wade decision that was decided 50 years ago, they used trimesters as sort of the measuring stick for when pregnancy could be allowed, could be regulated by the states, and when an abortion no longer becomes part of that. Under this proposal, they don't use a number of weeks or trimesters, but rely on the healthcare professionals that have the ability with ultrasounds and the science that they've developed to measure the fetal viability of the baby in the uterus. And based on that professional wisdom of those healthcare professionals, they will be able to say if the baby is removed from the uterus and does not require extraordinary medical treatment, it is viable outside the womb, and the state has the ability to regulate that and say, you've missed your opportunity for an abortion. Prior to that time, when there is no fetal viability, then the state would be able to regulate it. It says that unlike what other states have done, Michigan would not be able to regulate it based on the idea that they're worried about the health of the fetus. It limits the state's interest to only the mental and physical health of the mother and the professional ability of the healthcare professionals to do their thing. So there's a lot of similarities to what we've known under Roe v. Wade, but it's not exactly the same. Does it go a little bit further? Well, it includes many things beyond abortion. And that was one of the concerns when Justice Thomas wrote his separate opinion in the Dobbs decision that undid Roe, that they're, by ruling the way that they did, that they opened up a lot of other things related to privacy. So, how do you think about how to vote on this? Well, a lot of people already have firm opinions about the morality of abortion. I can't help you to think about that, or I probably will not be able to change your mind on that. But if you're unsure and want to think about how all this plays out, you need to know that parallel to this proposed constitutional amendment, there are two lawsuits that challenge Michigan law, that law from 1846, and say it is in violation of our state constitution because of provisions of due process and provisions related to the bodily integrity of the mothers. Both of those have been heard by lower courts, but the state Supreme Court has not acted on them. So there's sort of three scenarios that could play out here. The first one is that we could defeat Proposal 3 and the Michigan Supreme Court say, they looked and they looked, but they cannot find an explicit right to an abortion in our state constitution, and that 1846 law will be in effect. We'll have many lawsuits because now you have to decide how a law from so long ago applies to the world we're in 2022, 2023. Of course, there will be far fewer abortions. It will not completely go away because we'll still have the abortions to protect the health of the mother. It'll be a different world, and we think healthcare providers will be working in a world of uncertainty because how all this applies and are they endangering their license by doing certain things will be troubling to them, and maybe so troubling that they're not willing to engage in certain things. Scenario 2 would be that we do in fact adopt Proposal 3 with votes at this election. We go back to many of the rights that we've known under Roe v. Wade. The state has a number of laws that regulate abortion. It isn't clear how many of those will carry forward to be effective under Proposal 3 and how many will have to be changed or offered in a different way. The amendment says there's a strict scrutiny, so there has to be a compelling state interest to do something to regulate this. So again, there will be lawsuits trying to figure out how that plays out. Healthcare professionals will have greater certainty that they can do things to help the mother as it relates to pregnancy. And the third scenario is that perhaps Proposal 3 is defeated, but the state Supreme Court does find that there is an implicit right to abortion in our state constitution. And then we see again a number of lawsuits as what exactly does that mean? When is it allowed? What sort of everything we did 50 years ago when Roe was decided, what exactly does it mean? How do you put the detail into that? It is sure to be an uncertain world as it relates to issue of abortion in Michigan for many years to come, regardless of what we decide. And people have to apply their own lens to the issue of abortion.
It's a very tough topic with a lot of different perspectives, and I'm really trying to keep onto the, straight and narrow of what the thing is. And it's interesting to talk about the uncertainty because that is something that I have learned covering politics and policy for a while, is that when you have people that are very entrenched in their beliefs, they generally, regardless of the policy, it's been my observation, they generally don't give up on those. Like, very rarely do people say, okay, you got me, right? It goes on and on and on and on, especially with issues that are very closely held by people.
Yeah. So as I think about public policy and lawmaking, I think we have government to manage the interaction between people, and that sort of requires some level of compromise. But the world we live in today is that we have become so hyper-partisan, and everyone is afraid to give just a little bit, lest it be seen as a sort of weakness and an undoing of your beliefs in some way. Like you say, that people are not willing to bend, and I think it's a lack of trust in your fellow citizens, a lack of trust in the politicians that we're electing to represent us. And that's a big problem that we have to fix somewhere along the line here.
Oh, yeah. And this is just my personal opinion. I believe media has a role to play in that, too. Whether it's talking on the news or, a good Twitter dunk, right? Like, that raises money, that gets attention. And I remember before Senator Carl Levin passed, I interviewed him for Our Magazine. And one of the things that he shared was it used to be that you could really get a lot of mileage out of giving other people credit. Sometimes to get things done, you would step aside and be like, okay, even though this was something I really pushed, I'm going to go ahead and let someone else take the credit so that this thing can get done. And that world has kind of turned on its side. And so that's why you have a situation where, and this isn't just about Proposal 3, this is about pretty much every issue right now, where it is so that you have to stick in no matter what, even if there is a common sense proposal that the majority or vast majority of voters want. That isn't necessarily who controls the conversation. And so that makes sometimes things difficult. And part of why, these ballot proposals are so important, because a lot of times it's been difficult to get legislation through the legislature to get things done through our elected officials. And so these ballot proposals are kind of like a way to jump the system in a way, in the view of some.
That's right. We've created this process to have grassroots democracy, that the people have the ability to weigh in on these things, but special interests and politicians, political parties have grown to play an oversized role in them. And that's the world we live in right now. It's not the best, but it's the best we have.
Well, as they say, we will muddle through and make it happen, because really, what other options do we have? But I really appreciate your time, Eric Lupher from the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. If you haven't been to their website, crcmich.org, you're going to want to go. You all are constantly putting up updates and policy briefs and things across the state, as well as things very relevant to Detroit and Metro Detroit.
Yeah, we've created a Detroit bureau that's focused solely on Detroit and blog about issues relative to Detroit at least once a month, and have a number of major policy papers thinking about issues like fixing Detroit's property tax problems. I encourage everyone to come crcmich.org, come see what it's about, and join into our fun thinking about public policy issues.
Well, that was a lot, but I hope you got something out of it. Of course, if you got questions, dailydetroit@gmail.com. Thanks to our members at patreon.com/dailydetroit for helping this coverage happen. Quick bit of programming. Tomorrow, Devin O'Reilly will be in the studio, and we're going to talk with him about all the things happening around Detroit. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.